In the twilight of the 19th century, the world map was a tapestry of pink. The color represented the British Empire, the largest dominion in human history, an entity so vast that it was said the sun never set upon it. From the bustling wharves of Hong Kong to the diamond mines of South Africa, from the icy wastes of the Canadian North to the sheep stations of Australia, Queen Victoria reigned supreme. Her navy, the Royal Navy, possessed dominance over the world's oceans that had not been challenged since the days of Napoleon. London was not just a capital city. It was the beating heart of the global financial system, the clearinghouse of world trade, and the arbiter of international law. To the British ruling class, the Victorian aristocracy who managed this colossal enterprise from the leather armchairs of their clubs on Pall Mall, the world was orderly, hierarchical, and British. Across the Atlantic, however, a different kind of power was stirring. The United States of America was a nation that European powers viewed with a complex mixture of condescension and unease. For most of the century, Americans had been seen as distant cousins, uncultured, loud, and obsessed with their own internal expansion. They had spent decades slaughtering each other in a civil war, and then slaughtering the indigenous tribes of the West to secure their continent. By 1895, the frontier was closed. The American project of internal conquest was complete, and the energy that had driven pioneers across the prairies was now turning outward. The United States had quietly undergone a metamorphosis. While Britain was policing its far-flung colonies, America was building factories. Its steel output had surpassed Britain's. Its railway network dwarfed the rest of the world combined. Its population was exploding, fueled by waves of immigrants hungry for work. It was a sleeping giant, a coiled spring of industrial potential that had no outlet. The American economy was prone to violent booms and busts, and the Depression of 1893 had left the country angry, restless, and looking for a distraction. There was a rising spirit of jingoism, a feeling that America had grown up and deserved a seat at the table of great powers. These two tectonic plates, the descending trajectory of an overstretched British Empire and the ascending trajectory of an aggressive American Republic, were destined to collide. The collision point would not be a major strategic hub like the Suez Canal or the Straits of Gibraltar. It would be a mosquito-infested patch of jungle on the shoulder of South America, appearing on most maps as a blank space. The dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain was one of those colonial headaches that had dragged on for so long that most diplomats had forgotten how it started. It dated back to the Napoleonic Wars when Britain acquired the colony of British Guiana from the Dutch. The Dutch had never really defined the western border of their territory because nobody cared about the dense rainforests of the Orinoco Basin. It was a green hell of swamps and jaguars, impenetrable and economically worthless. But empires abhor a vacuum. In 1841, the British government sent a German naturalist and surveyor named Robert Schomburgk to map the colony. Schomburgk drew a line on a map that would become infamous. The Schomburgk line pushed the British boundary far to the west, claiming the mouth of the Orinoco River, the commercial artery of Venezuela. The Venezuelans protested, pointing to old Spanish maps showing their territory extending all the way to the Essequibo River. Britain ignored them. Venezuela was a weak, instability-prone republic racked by civil wars and coups, while Britain was the master of the world. The dispute simmered for 50 years as a low-level diplomatic irritant. Then came the gold. In the late 19th century, prospectors discovered massive alluvial gold deposits in the Urari River region, right in the heart of the disputed territory. Suddenly, the worthless jungle was worth a fortune. The largest gold nugget ever found, famously weighing over 500 ounces, was pulled from that mud. A gold rush began. British miners and settlers flooded into the zone. The British government, sensing revenue and strategic advantage, formalized its claim to the Schomburgk Line and then pushed further, claiming an additional 33,000 square miles of territory. For Venezuela, this was an existential threat. The British were not just taking jungle. They were threatening control of the Orinoco Delta, which would effectively give them a stranglehold over the Venezuelan economy. The Venezuelan government severed diplomatic relations with Britain in 1887 and appealed to European powers for help, but nobody wanted to offend London. Venezuela realized it had only one card left. It had to drag the United States into the fight. The Venezuelan government hired a former American ambassador named William Scruggs as a lobbyist. Scruggs was a master of propaganda. He wrote a pamphlet titled British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine, on trial and distributed it to every congressman, senator, and newspaper editor in Washington. His argument was simple and inflammatory. Britain was violating the sacred principle of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, declared by President James Monroe in 1823, stated that the American continents were not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by European powers, and warned that any European attempt to extend its system to the Western Hemisphere would be seen as dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. For 70 years, the doctrine had been largely theoretical. The U.S. Navy was too small to enforce it against the Royal Navy. But Scruggs' pamphlet landed in Washington at the exact moment the United States was looking for a fight. President Grover Cleveland, a Democrat known for his stubborn integrity, was politically besieged. The economy was in ruins, strikes and riots were rampant, and his party was losing ground to Republicans who accused him of being weak on foreign policy. Cleveland needed a win, and his Secretary of State, Richard Olney, a corporate lawyer from Boston, with a bulldog temperament and a deep belief in American exceptionalism, saw an opportunity. He looked at the map of South America and did not see a border dispute. He saw a test. If Britain could redraw Venezuela's borders whenever it found gold, the Monroe Doctrine would be meaningless. In the summer of 1895, Olney drafted a diplomatic note to the British government. It became one of the most famous and aggressive documents in the history of American diplomacy. Olney did not just ask Britain to arbitrate the dispute. He lectured them. He wrote that the United States was practically sovereign on this continent, and that its fiat was law within the hemisphere. It was a breathtaking assertion of power. In the Western Hemisphere, the United States was the supreme authority. Olney's note was sent to London in July 1895, landing on the desk of British Prime Minister Lord Salisbury. Salisbury was a relic of an older age, a bearded, aristocratic giant who conducted diplomacy with the weary cynicism of someone who had seen it all. He viewed the United States as a boisterous, culturally inferior upstart. He read Olney's note with a mixture of amusement and irritation, dismissing its arguments as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine, he correctly noted, was not part of international law. It was a unilateral declaration by an American president with no standing in European courts. Salisbury made a fatal error. He ignored the note. He let it sit on his desk while attending to other matters in Africa and the Near East, assuming the Americans were merely blowing off steam for domestic political consumption. In Washington, however, the silence was deafening. 4 months passed. To Cleveland and Olney, the delay was a calculated insult, a display of the British aristocracy looking down its nose at the American Republic. Finally, in late November, Britain responded with 2 separate notes. Salisbury meticulously dismantled Olney's arguments, lecturing the Americans on history and law. He stated flatly that the Monroe Doctrine did not apply to a boundary dispute between a European colony and an American state, and refused arbitration. The tone was polite, but the message was absolute. Mind your own business. When Cleveland read the reply, he was furious. The British had not just said no. They had treated the United States like a child needing to be schooled. Cleveland decided to escalate, taking the issue out of the quiet corridors of diplomacy and into the public arena. He threatened war. On December 17, 1895, Cleveland sent a special message to Congress. The text hit Washington like a bombshell. He asked Congress to appropriate funds to create an American commission to investigate the border dispute. That sounded reasonable enough, but then came the kicker. Cleveland declared that once the commission determined the true border, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power any appropriation by Britain of lands determined to belong to Venezuela. In diplomatic language, this meant war. The reaction in the United States was instantaneous and explosive. The chamber of Congress erupted in cheers. Republicans and Democrats united overnight against the old enemy. The press went wild, with headlines screaming war with England and the lion twisting the eagle's tail. The Civil War generation, remembering British sympathy for the Confederacy, felt a surge of vengeful patriotism. Irish-American communities were ecstatic at the prospect of fighting the British. Crowds gathered in New York, Boston, and Chicago to sing patriotic songs. Militia regiments began drilling. A war fever swept the nation, fueled by decades of pent-up industrial energy and national pride. Americans were eager to prove they were no longer a second-rate power. They were ready to take on the mistress of the seas. In London, news of Cleveland's message arrived with the morning papers on December 18th. The British public was bewildered. They had paid almost no attention to the Venezuela issue, regarding it as a minor border squabble in a jungle they could not locate on a map. Suddenly, they discovered that the President of the United States was threatening to invade Canada and sink the Royal Navy. Initially, shock and disbelief gripped Britain. They assumed it was a joke or a political stunt. As reports from the British ambassador in Washington arrived, the gravity sank in. This was not a stunt. The Americans were deadly serious. Salisbury convened his cabinet. The mood was grim. British naval power, though large, was scattered across the globe protecting trade routes from Suez to Singapore. To fight the Americans, the fleet would have to concentrate in the Atlantic, leaving the empire vulnerable in Asia and the Mediterranean. The British Army was tiny compared to the potential manpower of the United States, and Canada, the crown jewel of the British Empire in North America, was essentially a hostage. American troops could march into Montreal and Toronto within weeks with little resistance. Furthermore, the Americans had a terrifying industrial capacity. They could build ironclads and destroyers faster than British shipyards. A war with the United States would not be a quick colonial skirmish. It would be a grinding total war against a continent-sized nation with limitless resources. But the most immediate threat was financial. On Wall Street, the threat of war caused a panic. On Black Friday, British investors holding billions in American railway stocks and bonds rushed to sell, drying up liquidity in the London market. The British elite found themselves staring into the abyss. They were isolated. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing increasingly belligerent. In Africa, the Boers were arming themselves. In the Far East, Russia and Japan were rising. Britain had no allies. Its proud policy of splendid isolation now looked dangerous. Salisbury faced the most difficult decision of his life: fight for imperial honor and risk total war with America, or swallow his pride, admit the world had changed, and yield to the Americans. As Christmas 1895 approached, the world held its breath. Newspapers were filled with talk of ironclads and invasion routes, and telegraph cables between London and Washington hummed with coded messages. The British lion was crouching. The American eagle was screaming. In early 1896, a distraction on the other side of the world saved the peace. News arrived in London of the Jameson Raid, a botched British attack on the Boer Republic of the Transvaal. The raid ended in capture and humiliation, and the German Kaiser sent a telegram congratulating the Boers, directly insulting Britain. The public outrage redirected attention to Germany. For Salisbury, it was a gift. The American threat now seemed manageable compared to the German challenge. Britain could back down without appearing weak. Negotiations followed, and in February 1896, Britain agreed to submit the Venezuela border dispute to a neutral arbitration tribunal. This marked the blink moment. Britain accepted that the United States had the right to intervene. The arbitration panel met in Paris in 1899, consisting of 2 British judges, 2 American judges acting as Venezuelan lawyers, and a neutral Russian diplomat. The tribunal awarded Britain nearly 90% of the disputed territory, largely upholding the Schomberg Line. The gold mines stayed in British hands. The location of the border mattered little. The precedent mattered immensely. Britain acknowledged it could no longer act unilaterally in the Americas. Washington was now the supreme authority of the Western Hemisphere. This marked the beginning of a profound shift in British grand strategy, known to historians as the Great Reproach. The British ruling class, deeply shaken by the crisis, began a ruthless reassessment of their global position. They looked at the rising power of Germany and Europe, the expansion of Russia in Asia, and the industrial explosion of the United States. They realized the era of Victorian dominance was over. Prioritization became essential. They concluded that the United States was the one power they could not defeat and therefore must be befriended. This was not sentimental. It was cold, hard realpolitik. British leaders recognized that American industrial strength would increasingly become the fulcrum of the world economy. Securing U.S. friendship was the best insurance policy for the survival of the British Empire elsewhere. This strategic recalibration led to a systematic campaign of appeasement. Over the next decade, Britain quietly liquidated its strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere, handing them over to the United States one by one. The first major concession was the Panama Canal. For 50 years, the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty had bound Britain and the U.S. stipulating that any canal across Central America must be a joint project to prevent either nation from gaining a monopoly. In 1901, the United States demanded full control of the canal, its construction, ownership, and fortification. Britain, once resolute in defending global choke points, acquiesced without requesting territorial concessions or payment. This was a peace offering, an acknowledgement that the Caribbean had become an American lake. Next came military withdrawals. For 2 centuries, the Royal Navy's North America and West Indies Squadron had symbolized British power in the Americas. Based in Bermuda, Halifax, and Jamaica, these ships enforced imperial will along the coasts. In the early 20th century, First Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher made a radical decision. He recalled the squadron, scrapped outdated gunboats, and brought battleships home to face the German threat in the North Sea. British Caribbean bases were hollowed out, garrisons reduced, and the frontier with the United States effectively demilitarized. Britain had calculated that defending Canada or Jamaica against America was unnecessary. The U.S. was now the de facto police force of the region. The power vacuum created by Britain's withdrawal was filled immediately. In 1898, just 3 years after the Venezuela Crisis, the United States launched the Spanish-American War, ousting Spain from Cuba and seizing Puerto Rico. Britain did not protest. In fact, it supported the Americans. While France and Germany sympathized with Spain, Britain encouraged U.S. actions. The British press cheered the American victory, and diplomats blocked other European powers from intervening. A new partnership was forming. Britain outsourced the security of the Western Hemisphere to Washington. This dynamic was reinforced in 1902 during the Venezuelan debt crisis. Venezuela, refusing to pay European creditors, faced blockades and bombardments from Britain, Germany, and Italy. President Theodore Roosevelt, wary of European interference in the Americas, formulated the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The U.S. would act as an international police power, intervening in Latin America to prevent European powers from seizing territory under the pretext of debt collection. The British reaction was telling. They immediately withdrew, publicly supporting the U.S. in its policing role. Within 7 years, Britain had transformed from threatening war over a jungle border to inviting the Americans to manage the hemisphere. The Venezuela crisis had profound consequences for the 20th century. Britain secured a junior partnership, gaining a vital ally in the United States. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain, financially exhausted, relied on American loans and industry to continue fighting. If the 1895 crisis had gone differently, the United States might have remained neutral or even sided with Germany. Instead, the humiliation of 1895 forged a special relationship that preserved Britain's existence, though not its superpower status. For Venezuela, the result was a mixed blessing. British expansion had been stopped, but the United States assumed dominance over their politics and oil industry for the next century. The Monroe Doctrine, originally designed to protect Latin America from European imperialism, had ensured that the only acceptable imperialism was American. Today, the border region between Guyana and Venezuela remains a wild, beautiful jungle. Yet the invisible line drawn there represents a historical fault line, the point where the 19th century ended. The 20th century began, the British lion turned tail, and the United States learned it could command the world. The 1895 crisis is a forgotten prequel to the modern world, proving that the most significant wars are often those never fought. Britain lost the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot. Yet in doing so, it secured the lifeline needed to survive the storms ahead. I'm Alex, and this is History Behind Money. Subscribe now to stay ahead of the curve, because when the history books are written, you'll want to be among the few who saw it.